For a conversation about the political violence crisis, please welcome Atlantic staff writers Anne Applebaum, George Packer, and Adam Serwer. Here to lead the conversation is Atlantic editor-in-chief Jeffrey Goldberg.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us for another fun-filled day discussion of political violence. Just start off light, little opera, little political violence. I have three of my finest colleagues, smartest colleagues. You're all familiar with their writing. You've seen them speak. It's very exciting to put this group together. Obviously, we just put this idea together in the last few days, responding to events. But we have Anne Applebaum, obviously one of the great scholars of the Soviet Union, of Russia, of political extremism. George Packer has written so much about American democracy and American democratic decay. Is that fair?
I think that's the right word.
Okay. I'm really lifting everybody up this morning. And Adam Serwer, who also writes about democratic decay. In particular, Adam's done great work on independent judiciary and other issues related to the way our country is organized, the way the country is supposed to be organized. I want to start with a very simple question, and it's open-ended answers. I want to ask each of you to define the problem we have at the moment. And the sort of colloquial way we would ask this, start with Anne, is how bad is it right now compared to what we've seen in other countries, what we've seen in American history, and where you think it could go?
So, of course, there have been other moments in American history that were more violent. The Civil War was more violent. Actually, the Revolution was more violent, and the run-up to the Revolution and the Civil War was more violent, and Reconstruction was more violent. And I didn't know, the 60s numerically must have been also far more violent. I think there is an aspect of the current situation, though, that's a little bit different. And it's one of the reasons why almost all of us feel affected by it. And that's that for the first time, we live in a world in which people who, we have a media system, a social media system, that encourages the most outrageous, the most extreme statements, and then rewards them financially. So the instinct of most people, which is to be moderate, to be calm, to create consensus. And of course, that's what our political system is supposed to do, to create consensus, to bring in the extremes, is being defeated by this very, very loud noise. And we can all hear the noise. And periodically, people are affected by the noise in one way or the other. But the fact that we have the system that it pays you and encourages you to have extremism, I think that's, or to use extreme language, I think that's what's different, and I think that's what's making people feel afraid. So it's not just politicians or prominent figures or celebrities who feel afraid by what they see on the media or what they see on their phones. It's also ordinary people who think, well, if all this is happening out there, am I allowed to say what I think at my work? Or am I in danger if I go to this event? And I feel that the all-encompassing nature of it, that it's there with us all the time, this is what's different.
George?
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a sort of unreality to a lot of this. There's so much performance online, but performances lead to physical performances. I mean, there's a kind of impulse when you hear the words, when you see the images over and over again. There are going to be a few individuals who are going to take it to the real world, and yet it remains, there is something about our politics today that is so performative that it's hard to know how deep the problem runs. Is the country on the verge of a civil war? I don't think so. Do most Americans want a state of perpetual violence? I don't think so, but you begin to imagine it might be true if your life is lived online, if you're a hyper-engaged Politico on the left or the right for whom that is reality. I mean, there's three things that are interrelated that are all leading to a worse and worse atmosphere. One is social media, which I think is just a hellscape, and I avoided it from the start, more because I thought I'd become addicted to it than that I felt superior to it. But now I feel superior to it, and fully I told you so, vindicated. The second is this profound polarization that, again, is hard to judge, hard to calculate or weigh, because so much of it is driven by the financial incentives of the platforms, and yet it is entirely our politics today. Cracker Barrel changes its logo, and it becomes a huge political incident. Everything gets fed into the machine of polarization. If you're for it, I'm against it. And the third is authoritarianism. We are living under a regime, and its reaction to the ugly reaction in a few quarters to the Charlie Kirk killing shows that that's the impulse of an authoritarian regime, to be utterly unable to hear criticism and even mockery that it doesn't like. So those three things together, social media as kind of the motor of it all, polarization as the political expression of it and reality of it in Washington and elsewhere, and then what's come from the top down in the last 8 months, all of those to me are dangerous ingredients that I don't know how to begin to undo.
Adam?
I think we have to have a realistic recollection of how violent American politics used to be. I mean, in 1893, in Paris, Texas, they burned a black man at the stake, a bunch of, and when he was dying, they recorded his screams and sold them commercially on gramophone. So, we've come a long way from there in the sense that I think the consensus against political violence is actually pretty strong. And that's one reason why you see all these conservative influencers on social media trying as hard as they can to say we're at war, we're in an asymmetric war, because the average rank and file Republican is actually not supportive of political violence. And I think you could see at Democratic leadership who all condemned the assassination of Charlie Kirk that they don't support political violence either. The problem, I think, is, not just social media, but the fact is we have a government of posters. And so their incentives socially are to say the most extreme thing possible in order to get that reaction from their audience. And it's not just people who are just personalities, right-wing personalities in the media, but actually our government. People act like this. If you look at someone like Ted Cruz or Donald Trump, I mean, they're people who are trying to get a particular reaction from their audience by talking about the other side in extreme a manner as possible. So it's not, it's not just social media. It's not just, it's not just the government. It's a combination of all of these things. And I think what we have to hope is that consensus against political violence, which is a very hard one, holds in a situation where essentially the people who run the federal government are trying to turn up the temperature as high as possible. And I don't think that you've ever seen before. I mean, even during the height of lynching, Democratic presidents wouldn't say, lynching, that's a great thing. But now you have people saying, Democrats are terrorists, we're going to go after them, we're going to suppress our political opposition. And the reality of it is that the Trump administration, Trumpism, is functionally, at its core, a program of political violence against undesirables. I mean, that's what mass deportation is. That's what it means when you send a guy to a prison, torture prison overseas because he's Hispanic and he has a tattoo. That's what it means when you throw people in jail because they wrote pro-Palestinians op-eds. That's what it means when you say the police are allowed to abuse certain populations with impunity. So I think, there's political violence, but in some sense, Trumpism is the translation of political violence into state violence against people who, their constituencies have been convinced to be terrified of in order to justify it.
I want to ask all of you this question as well. I'll start with you, Adam. And at the risk of being overly reductionist, the debate now, or maybe a kind of sterile or arid debate, is left-wing violence more dangerous or more prevalent than right-wing violence? Or are we dealing with something else entirely, which is a kind of nihilistic social media self-radicalization violence that's kind of, it's like a shitposting violence more than anything else. But Adam, talk about that. This is what people on the left want to talk about and people on the right want to talk about. It's the other side that's doing the violence. How do you understand this problem, this question?
Well, again, in some sense, it's good that we're arguing about who's violent because that means that consensus against political violence still remains.
Right.
By the data, the truth is that, historically in the United States, right-wing political violence is far more prevalent. In other countries, it's different, but here, that's the reality. But I think it's almost, beyond reinforcing that consensus against political violence, it becomes non-productive when you're using it to justify political violence against the other side. It's one thing when you're saying, you should vote for me because the other guy's kind of a jerk. But it's another thing when you're saying, the other side are terrorists and that's why we're going to use the force of the government to censor and suppress them. That actually, I think, is very dangerous because it risks justifying political violence in people's minds. I think there's two things that can lead to further political violence. One is disenfranchisement, because disenfranchised populations in the United States are often the targets of political violence because there's very little political consequence to targeting them. And the other is if people feel like they cannot fully participate in the political process, and if a government decides to make that a reality by cutting them out of it, I think things can get very bad very fast, and I hope that does not happen.
George?
Well, I would add, the other condition for political violence is when you think the other side wants to destroy you, that everything you care about, all your values, your country, the country that you have cherished and want to live in and want your children to live in is about to be destroyed. That thinking, which is there in the language of both the left and the right all the time, is just a boiling pot for violence. On the other hand, I want to make sure
it turns your violent impulses into defensive in your own mind.
You're afraid. You're not pissed off at somebody. You're afraid that they're coming after you and everything you care about, and you have to defend yourself and your family. But let's remember that with all the ugliness online and in our political discourse today, and it is so ugly. Just look at a debate from 1980 or from 2012 and think about how our discourse has degenerated since then. It's pretty shocking. Nonetheless, to go from that to getting a gun and planning a killing and carrying it out is an enormous leap. And I want to draw a bright line between them. Even though we all know that a context, an atmosphere of violence can lead to violence, there still has to be a sense that in some ways, we have to tolerate. We don't want it, but we're not going to equate it with firing a gun. And that's what leads to crushing freedom of speech, when people equate words with violence, which is done all the time. But it's dangerous, because then you're going to lose your rights.
You talked about social media, this nihilistic violence, which I almost think of as apolitical violence. It's people taking memes, people taking inside jokes from Reddit, 4chan, Telegram, and they are, for whatever reason, dissatisfied with their world, their lives, and they're making this new amalgamation of politics that doesn't adhere to ideological streams. How do you fight that in our education system, in families?
Well, we know who the shooters are in almost all of these cases. Do we know what really motivated them? Do they have an ideology? What have been their words? We really don't have enough information in almost every case to be able to say, these are the ideas that led to this killing.
Right. Or the ideas that even the point.
Yeah,
well,
the point.
I mean, this is what I was going to say, is that I don't know that we understand enough about what it means to, and I don't even know what it means for myself, to look all day at a series of constantly changing images, and to then be, then to have an algorithm or selecting the images for you that become progressively more and more extreme. That if you look at a picture of if you sympathize with animal rights activists, and you stay on that, and you continue to do so, you will eventually be shown animal rights terrorists. I mean, that's been proven. People have done experiments with that over and over again. And I just don't think we know what the effect of that is on people's brains. And that combined with here's where you could make a comparison of America to other countries. When you have people who have, when you have a world where politics is all culture wars, so it's all about identity and it's about the nature of what kind of country do we have. This is when you have irresolvable conflicts. I mean, the example that we were using just when we were speaking before was Northern Ireland. It seemed, for a long time, it was just irreconcilable. Either that piece of territory was Irish or it was British, and you couldn't find a halfway, or there were people who felt there couldn't be a halfway. And that meant that the only solutions were violent. And the only way they were able ever to overcome that was by changing the conversation and having the conversation be about, instead of existential culture identity issues, to have the conversation be about where should we build the bridge, or should the youth education center be in this part of town or in that part of the town. And they tried to get people to focus on real life issues of, infrastructure or healthcare or education, as a way, which didn't mean that they still didn't hate each other and they still didn't want to kill each other, but at least when they were arguing, they weren't arguing over something existential. And so we have got to a place in America where so many of our conversations are existential conversations about identity and who we are. And that's the piece of it.
Who's responsible for shifting that dialogue in that apocalyptic direction?
I mean, there are many different kinds of people you can blame.
Newt Gingrich.
Sorry?
What?
Newt Gingrich.
Newt Gingrich.
Yes, I think.
Well, wait, you wrote about Newt Gingrich in The Unwinding several years ago.
I picked him out as the key political figure, because I had all these different sectors of our society. He was the key political figure who turned our politics into total war, into nonstop permanent warfare. Which back then it does seem a little innocent because it was about.
I'm fascinated by Gingrich. Were you able to identify what was the germ of genius? I use the term in a value-neutral way, but what was the insight that he had about Americans, about human nature, about technology? How did it all?
Well, first of all, C-SPAN had just put cameras into Congress when he got to Congress in the late 70s. He saw that as a great opportunity to speak directly to the public, not to have to go through the press. He saw that politics was not about ideas and policies. It was about emotions. And if you could reach people's emotions, and this is not original to him, there's a long, sad history of this in the 20th century. If you could reach people's emotions, you had them. And their unreason would take over. And so he had these tapes that he made and that Republican candidates for Congress would listen to back when there were cassette tapes in their cars as they drove around their district campaigning. And the tapes had all the words that they should start using in their campaign remarks in order to get people crazy and to call the opponent a traitor and an enemy and evil. Those words appeared in those tapes. And that language stuck because it worked, because it got people riled up.
And that's a very, very old tactic. I mean, this is the Carl Schmitt idea that what politics is really about is about creating enemies and building a sense of, of division. And then you just want to make sure that the division is designed in such a way that you're in the majority and the enemy, whoever it is in the minority.
Right.
So that idea goes back a long way.
It does.
This is the Nazi philosopher. To be clear.
To be clear.
I think it's important to remember, democracy is a system for resolving conflicts nonviolently, including the most heated conflicts we can imagine. I think the problem is, and I think, your story about Gingrich sort of gets at it, which is that right now we have a system of social incentives that encourages the people who are currently in power to turn up the temperature as much as possible. So in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk killing, you saw these, you saw Barack Obama, you saw Schumer, you saw these Democratic politicians saying, hey, political violence is wrong, et cetera, and then Donald Trump gets on TV and says, basically, we're going to crush the left. And until the incentives change, the social incentives change for, Republican elites to stop turning up the temperature in that way, I just think it's not, the temperature is going to keep going higher. They're going to keep turning that knob on the stove, and I'm not sure how you fix that.
I want to get to fixes if there are fixes, but stay on this. I'm very curious about the way in which people on the right have adopted, maybe you can deal with this because you're a scholar of communism, have adopted some of
Ironically,
totalizing ideas that came from Lewinsky to the further left. It seems as if the idea of like freezing and kind of excoriating, building this enemy. I guess this is maybe I'm asking for a commentary on the horseshoe theory that the far left and the far right, especially when it comes to political violence and totalizing extremism, are actually quite related in their systems approach, if not in the actual content of the ideology.
Well, they had one thing in common, which is that they understood, or they theorized that what really mattered was control over the culture. And this is what you hear this now from the American right all the time, and this is what Project 2025 is about, is that it's not enough to have political power, it's not enough to win an election. What you need to do is to capture the culture. And they've had a theory for the long time that the left has captured the culture, whereas in fact a lot of the culture is neutral or it's created in independent ways. Whatever, that's a longer argument. But if you need to capture the culture, then you need to change the institutions. And so in their case, they need to change the civil service, and they need to ban PBS, and they need to
literally seize the Kennedy Center.
And they need to seize the Kennedy Center and seize the Smithsonian and sue the New York Times and take down the, broadcast media. And that's all. I mean, it's not. I don't think it's all a carefully worked out plan, but it's certainly the instinct from the beginning has been that those are the institutions that we need to take over. And in our political system, for as long as it's existed, those institutions were never, sometimes they've been political one way or the other, but they were meant to be somehow independent. And so they have an idea that all the independent institutions, and by the way, this could also move to the courts, and as I said, civil service, need to be politicized. And one of the things we forget about liberal democracy is actually, if it's going to work and it's going to last, it's dependent on the existence of non-political institutions. So there has to be, the case that when you win an election, you don't get to control everything, because if you control everything, then there won't be another free election in 4 years' time. So there have to be independent courts, there has to be independent media, there has to be independent culture. The business class has to be somehow independent. We've had a meritocratic, independent civil service, at least in theory, since the late 19th century, and it's meant to work for Democrats and Republicans. And once you destroy those things, then you begin to make democracy more difficult.
But if the CDC is picking its Ebola expert based on how they vote, we're cooked.
That's right. And this was, by the way, this is what the Bolsheviks were. So the Bolsheviks also said, you get to be promoted, you get to be president of the university or head of the construction company if you're a really believing Marxist.
I do think, though, that historically here and in Europe, the left has had the cultural power and the right has had the political power much more often than the other way around. And it was certainly true in the last 10 years. Now I'm trying to think of it a little bit through the point of view of Project 2025. There was a progressive movement in the last decade that did take over a lot of institutions and that was quite censorious and repressive in many ways. And cancel culture was real. I was involved in the writing of the Harper's Letter, which was a totally anodyne plea for a more open atmosphere for speech, and it just got killed. It was as if we had called for genocide. The left went after it as if it was the worst document that ever existed. Some of those same people, of course, are now calling for free speech because the shoe is on the other foot. So the left had the cultural influence that the right thought was destroying the country. I don't think it was destroying the country. The right thought it was destroying the country. The right is now using political power government, the top of government, the presidency.
Actually, government repression.
Yes,
yeah.
which the left never did. And that is a more powerful form.
The FCC is radically shifted. The head of the FCC has radically shifted his position on free speech.
In 2019, he tweeted, how dare the FCC tell any broadcaster what they can say? And he has deleted that tweet in the last few days.
Pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Adam, I want both George and Adam to talk about Charlie Kirk for a bit. You spent a lot of time watching Charlie Kirk. Adam, you live and report in Texas, and I'm wondering if you could frame for us a little bit of the role Charlie Kirk played in creation of a political ecosystem outside of the East Coast so-called elite enclaves.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, first I want to preface what I'm going to say by saying that political violence, and in particular Charlie Kirk's murder, was unjustifiable and wrong. But Kirk was a conduit for far-right ideas to the Republican mainstream. And I'll just give an example, him saying that the Civil Rights Act was a mistake. I'm simply not going to agree that I'm not allowed to criticize a man who thinks that my tax dollars should pay to have police remove my family from a whites-only restaurant. I'm just not going to accept that I'm supposed to not be critical of that. And I think what you saw from Kirk, and again, it in no way justifies his assassination, was that he took a lot of these ideas, the idea that we should return to the immigration laws of the 1920s, that we should persecute trans people, that women should submit to their husbands. He was a conduit for these ideas to the Republican mainstream because he presented them in a way that was more palatable than the extremists whose names we all know, and I'm not going to give them a percentage by naming them. And I think, to a certain extent, part of what the enforced mourning of Charlie Kirk right now that Republicans are trying to implement is to make people endorse those ideas even though they might not want to. And I think that is part of the general repression of free speech that the Trump administration is involved in, which comes from a basic philosophy of free speech is when we can say what we want and when you can say what we want.
So can you talk about, you're an expert on Texas politics. Can you talk about, just using that as a representative state, of a complicated state, very red state with very, very deep blue pockets. Can you talk about the rise of what maybe you would call this kind of intolerant conservatism among the young in your state?
Well, you can look at or the past couple of years, Greg Abbott has presented himself as a champion of free speech, and he sort of spent last weekend highlighting students who he felt should be expelled because they were, critical of Kirk's views or were nasty or rude to people who were mourning Charlie Kirk, which obviously I don't endorse, but free speech is free speech.
Trying to get rid of people who have been nasty on social media is a recipe for their own destruction, obviously.
But I think, the issue here is that we have introduced this idea that government is supposed to settle these kinds of arguments, and it's not. Once you get government involved in saying, this is acceptable and this is not acceptable, you just saw the head of Texas A&M get removed because, a professor committed thought crime in one of his classes, and that was recorded by a conservative student. When you have that sort of situation, you simply cannot have free speech. Free speech cannot exist in a world where people are afraid of being sanctioned by the state, and that was already happening in Texas, despite this posture of being pro-free speech, long before it came to United States government.
So let me just go down the road, starting with you, Adam, and talk about the solutions to this problem. Obviously, the country has gone through periods before, so we're not experiencing. There are novel aspects of this, including the social media aspect. But when you're thinking about what would change this dynamic and what would change the culture around the acceptability of violence, what do you think that is? Does it have to do with the people who run social media companies?
I don't know how it happens, but there has to be a political cost for engaging in that type of politics. And so far, that cost has not been big enough. Obviously, Trump lost in 2020. But the cost of demonizing your fellow citizens in the particular way that they do it in order to justify persecution of them, there has to be a cost for that. And until there's a cost for that, and I mean that politically, in terms of votes, in terms of the ballot box, unless, just in case anybody tries to take that out of context, until there is a political cost for that at the ballot box, politicians are going to continue to engage in that kind of behavior.
George?
Well, one solution, and I only mean this half facetiously, is for some international organizations.
I was just going to say that we need, a
This is
UN
Anne's-
negotiator.
Yeah, like in Bosnia, we need some NGOs, from around the world to come and teach Americans from red and blue states to work together, like
Actually,
to put
they
on
exist already.
to put on a musical together and have to make it really good. Even though they hate each other, they want the musical to be great, and so they're going to have to learn to work together, because we have lost what Tocqueville called the habits of the heart of self-government. We don't know how to talk to each other. We don't know how to work together. I think Adam is right.
So a prerequisite for this is the rebuilding of affection that Americans feel for each other based on their Americanness?
How will that happen? How will the bonds be reknitted? Well, one thing we've learned is it will not come from the elites. The elites have all been cowed. All those people who sat at that long table in Windsor Castle on the bounty of Donald Trump and King Charles, the leaders of our business and tech companies, et cetera, have been bought.
I vote for David Letterman based on yesterday.
Yes.
I think David Letterman should do it.
He's a sort of decayed elite, I guess, or something. He's pretty old. It will have to. Sorry. It'll have to come.
He's just saying that because Letterman watches Washington Week.
All right,
so
let me
he assumes
redeem
it,
myself here. It'll have to come from the revulsion.
But that spirit, I don't know if you saw it.
No,
but
let me
the
finish.
spirit of free, he had a free spirit about
He
this.
did.
Yeah.
It'll have to come from the revulsion of large numbers of ordinary people who just don't want to live this way, who don't want to keep hearing this, who don't want to keep seeing the violence, who are sick of their leaders manipulating them, of the tech barons manipulating them, and who just either with their votes, with their voices, say, we will not continue to be a part of this. That can take a very long time.
So this is the question, Anne, but we all have a lot of experience in Germany. Adam, you have a lot of experience in Italy. One of the things that's interesting when we visit places and talk in those places, like, guys, do you know, like, look at us. Look what we went through. You don't want to do that. Like they can teach through tragedy, but the question is, are we going to do this the easy way or the hard way?
No, I mean, in Germany, you had to have political collapse, war, chaos, and violence before you had this national movement to do a different kind of politics.
Right. And even there's some amnesia about, you know what?
And the amnesia is because people don't really remember it anymore, because it's the stories told to them by their grandparents, and it's not real anymore.
Right. But so then what, if you could focus on one area of this?
I mean, I keep coming back to the algorithms on social media, and I know we're now at a hopeless moment where nothing will be done, and obviously this administration won't do it. It could happen in Europe, but even to force them to be transparent, because what we have now is a system where we don't know why we're being shown this picture or that clip or that clip. And we don't have control over it. And so we are, we're not, when we're online, we aren't citizens. We aren't active members of a community. We're just recipients of
poison.
Or, I mean, even if it's cat videos, we're just recipients of whatever the machine thinks that we want to see. And some means of giving people more control over that and making that system transparent. And this is actually the argument that's happening in Europe right now, is there a form of regulation, social media regulation, that's not censorship, but gives people access, allows people to create their own algorithms or influence what it is that they see. And that's the only kind of technical solution I can come up with, and I don't see that it's feasible here right now.
There's also the regulation of social media as if they are publishers, which they are, so that
Right.
they're liable for defamation, so that Elon
Right.
Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and the owners of TikTok
Right.
are actually face legal consequences for defamation.
But the more realistic thing, actually, although I know you were half joking, I mean, the more realistic thing is a kind of grassroots movement. I mean, those have happened in America before, and they do change politics. I mean, we were talking earlier about the grassroots movement to make sure that there aren't telephones in schools, for example. Like, people understood it's bad
Right,
for
that
kids to have.
that actually is working.
That's actually happening.
or that smoking is bad,
or that
and maybe
smoking is
our
bad.
politics is unhealthy for you.
Well, you know, it's not that politics is unhealthy.
Warning labels.
It's that
Our politics.
passive politics in which you are manipulated by propaganda is bad for you. And you know, being an active member of your local, church group or political movement or PTA is good for you. I mean, and there's those were things that we did have in American life before, and maybe we could have again.
All right, go out and join the PTA, and no, it's.
But don't scream at the people you disagree with.
But try to understand that you're just not going to get along with everybody is important. Thank you all for doing this, Adam, George, Anne. Please read them constantly in The Atlantic. They're great. Thank you very much for doing this.